In May 1941, the Greek island of Crete was the only part of mainland Europe holding out against advancing Nazi forces, whose blitzkriegs had overrun the continent.
Britain is fighting on its own with the Commonwealth. It's fighting against Italy and Germany.
It was, up till then, the largest airborne operation ever known.
It seemed like a slaughter to me.
And it was also the only time in history when a major island has been captured entirely by airborne troops.
Who thinks the British are going to win? The British are hanging on in there as best they can, so Hitler's going to give them a serious battering. It looks really very bad.
As the huge wave of German aircraft approached, the island of Crete was defended by a poorly equipped Allied force. Such a huge airborne invasion had never been attempted before or since in war. This is the story of that unique battle and its aftermath. Crete is an island used to bloodshed and invasion throughout its long history. But the invasion and 4-year occupation of the island by German forces marked one of its most violent chapters. Stelios Tripolitakis started collecting memorabilia and relics from the war when he was 15 years old.
These are two 50 caliber machine guns, US made. These I found them in the crash site of a B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine bomber in Want Mountains.
Stelios has travelled all over the island, finding and restoring abandoned equipment, searching it out under the sea and on remote mountaintops.
This is a skin part from a Stuka, Junkers 87 Stuka dive bomber with a 1/4 of the Iron Cross. This is a brand machine gun. This one found in Galatas 3 years ago, buried under a very old olive tree.
Now his private collection, containing 80,000 pieces, has taken over his house in Galatas in western Crete, which saw fierce fighting.
These are German bandage boxes made. This is full, has all the bandages inside. The scissors to cut the bandages. The bandages, this is made in 1942. This is a BMW R12 German motorcycle made between 1935 and 1941. German paratrooper helmets from the Gulf of Crete. And this has taken a bullet hole. This shot killed him, you can see here.
Today, war graves of both Allied and German soldiers are scattered across Crete, along with memorials to Cretan civilians and resistance fighters, either killed or massacred by their German occupiers. In May 1941, the German invasion force consisted of 14,000 elite paratroopers who'd be dropped on the island. The aim was to take it from 30,000 Allied soldiers from Britain, Australia and New Zealand, and 12,000 Greek soldiers, tasked with defending it. The airborne invasion would be successful after just 2 weeks, but the campaign was bloody, with both sides inflicting huge losses. For Germany, they would lose more troops on the first day of battle than they'd lost in 18 months of the war thus far. The invasion had been coming for weeks. In the months previous, German troops had pushed down through the Balkans and just a few weeks earlier had taken mainland Greece. The capital, Athens, fell on April the 27th, and the swastika was raised over the Acropolis. The Italians under Mussolini had launched the invasion of Greece the previous year, but it was widely seen as a failure. German involvement turned it around.
The German successes in 1940 and 1941 really rewrote the rule book of military operations. They conquered France in 6 weeks when they'd been unable to do so for 4 years in the First World War. And they were able to do so because of the application of mobile warfare using mechanised formations and air power. These were unprecedented developments in military technique.
Thousands of Allied soldiers who'd been defending the mainland had been hurriedly evacuated to Crete, along with members of the Greek government and the King of Greece. Churchill needed to delay and thwart any further German expansion into North Africa and the Middle East, and decided to make a stand in Crete.
It was the end of a string of losses that began with Dunkirk.
Churchill turned to a New Zealand general, Bernard Freyberg, a Gallipoli hero and an old friend, to lead the defence of Crete.
They had been friends after the First World War. Bernard Freyberg turned up at dinner parties at Churchill's house, and Churchill would ask him to take off his clothes so they could count all the wounds that Freyberg had in the First World War, some of which, as Freyberg said, were the wounds going in and the shrapnel bullets going out.
Churchill called him the salamander, and a salamander is something that is reborn in fire. He appeared indestructible.
Crete is 160 miles long, between 7 and 30 miles wide, with 8,000-foot mountains dividing the north coast from a very steep southern coastline. In 1941, there were only 3 main roads connecting north and south. Other routes were no more than tracks and mountain paths.
All other roads were donkey trails, too poor for motor transport.
But from the island, the Luftwaffe could strike to the south, at the British sea routes to Egypt and Cyprus. With Rommel nearing Egypt, the Balkans already conquered, a 5th column waiting in Syria, a drive for Suez was ready, except for Crete.
The Mediterranean is useful for many reasons, but primarily it's a transit route between Western Europe and Australasia, East Asia. It's the artery that connects the whole of the British Empire up and enables the British to use one large fleet to patrol everything from the Atlantic to the China Seas. If you can't use the Mediterranean, that means you have to go all the way around Africa, which is a big problem.
But as the German Luftwaffe buzzed the skies above the island, preparations were made for the evacuation of the King and Greek government to Egypt, an indication as to the diminishing prospects for a successful defence.
Transportation inadequate.
The German invasion would involve an airborne division of the Luftwaffe, developed by Göring a few years before the war. It was known as the Flieger Corps, and the paratroopers were known as the Fallschirmjäger, or in English, Sky Hunters. The Fallschirmjäger were very effective when used in commando-style raids. Many were drawn from old elite Prussian military families and were famous for their willingness to give every effort, unwaveringly, even in the grimmest of situations.
The Fallschirmjäger are a very new force. They actually come from novel work that was done in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s on parachutes and parachute troops. But the Germans organised the force into a whole division. Hitler sees them as an elite force. They are used as the leading regiment in his birthday parade in 1939. He sees them as having operated very successfully in Norway and in Holland and in Belgium in the early part of the invasion of France in 1940. So they're escalating up from this early use to land on Crete.
The German parachute division, the 7th Parachute Division, had been formed really by Göring, partly because he wanted his own private army. Himmler had the Waffen-SS, and Göring went on all throughout the war, right till the very end, trying to increase his sort of Fallschirmjäger parachute units, even though many of them had never parachuted in their lives, purely so that he had a counterpart. The adventurous, lots of Nazis, young Nazi youth, it's true. They weren't entirely Nazi, but there was already in the Luftwaffe itself a higher level of Nazi membership or of Nazi believers than actually in the ordinary army itself.
By this stage, some of the younger ones would have seen some time in the Hitler Youth. They're growing up in the Nazi state. They're growing up in a world where things that we find simply incomprehensibly abhorrent are normative. So they're already desensitized. They've been taught to believe in theories of racial expansion, racial superiority, that it's their destiny to rule the world and their leader is going to carry them on to the new promised land. It's a combination of psychopathic and messianic, and it just resonates. It works. It clearly works because it mobilizes a huge military effort throughout the war.
By contrast, the Allied forces defending Crete were poorly equipped. There had been about 50,000 troops involved in the Greek campaign, 2/3 of them from Australia and New Zealand. The Australian Imperial Force was a volunteer one, the first to be raised since the First World War.
In Greece, an Anzac Corps, the literal meaning of the term, Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, that was only the second time that an Anzac Corps had ever been formed. Obviously the first in Gallipoli and the second in Greece.
There was a shortage of weapons among the defending troops. The 10,000 evacuees from the Greek mainland had been forced to leave a lot of their equipment behind.
At battalion and at brigade and at force level, the Australian and New Zealand commanders were tired. They had fought a very active campaign in North Africa. They'd fought a strenuous and absolutely exhausting fighting retreat through Greece. And so by the time they got to Crete, they were just worn out.
You've got an army that's lost its communications, its artillery, and its transport, dumped on Crete because that was the closest bus stop.
Against this background, Freiberg was a reluctant commander. It wanted to return to Egypt with his troops after the defeat on the Greek mainland. He cabled his HQ in Egypt, requesting the removal of troops he regarded as useless. Unwanted personnel who did not have weapons and had little or no employment other than getting into trouble with the civilian population. Most were removed before the battle began. The Australians were amongst those accused of behaving badly.
Prince Peter of Greece, who was Prince Philip's uncle, came across some Australians in Canea in a restaurant, and they were drunk and they were annoyed that they'd been run out of Crete and they were looking for anybody to take it out of. And one of them actually drew a pistol and threatened Prince Peter, who dived under a table, knocked the chap over, and the revolver went off and shot into the wall. So that wasn't really frightfully good behaviour on the part of that particular unit.
Air cover was confined to a handful of planes only. Most would be destroyed on the ground by German fighters. There would be no reinforcements, as Churchill had prioritised Libyan defences in North Africa and for the British base in Malta. This, then, was an army with no air defence.
So the Germans dominate the skies, and although Freiberg has managed to produce defensive positions with a lot of camouflage and bamboozle the Germans as to what's going on, it's still the case that once the Germans are there, they can call on air power, and we really can't.
So we start off with a weak position and we make it weaker by making bad decisions. And when you're on a roll and you're losing all the time, this is an army that's been defeated. They were driven out of Greece pretty chaotically. They lost a lot of the heavy equipment. Their formations are all jumbled up. So they came there on the back of a beating, and they didn't quite have what it took to resist.
The British Navy was effective in neutralising any invasion by sea, but its ships faced a serious challenge from the German Air Force.
So this is an air-sea battle for dominance of an island. And in many ways, the fighting on land is almost incidental. Is the air dominant? Is the sea dominant? If the air dominates, the Navy can't defend the island. If the Navy dominates, the Germans can't get to the island. So that's the seesaw of this whole battle. Who controls the air-sea space around the island?
In the weeks before invasion, only 2,700 of 27,000 tons of supplies shipped from Egypt arrived. The rest lost after ships carrying it were attacked by the Luftwaffe. In the days before the invasion, Germany's massive air arsenal was employed to ruthless effect to soften up Allied defences.
So they're training key parts of their air force in naval attack. And this is a difficult discipline. Flying over the sea is difficult. Hitting a target that's travelling at nearly 40 miles an hour and is manoeuvring violently and shooting back, that's really difficult. And that takes a lot of training. The best people at doing this in 1941 were the Japanese and the Germans, and they practiced a lot. So sinking a fast-moving British destroyer off Crete that's manoeuvring evasively and is trying to counter your attack, that is a real skill. Very few air forces can do this.
Hundreds of aircraft took part, including 200 planes from elite Stuka squadrons, Junkers Ju-87s, known variously as the Sirens of Death, the Flying Swastika, and the Jericho Trumpet, on account of the frightening noise they emitted when in a dive. The Stuka dive bombed to a degree of almost 90 degrees, an angle that had never been seen before, and at a speed of almost 400 miles per hour.
The Stuka is a specialist dive bomber. It's designed specifically to do that mission, to peel over at high altitude and to come down at nearly vertical and hit a fast-moving target with a precision drop weapon. In a clear sky, under complete German control, they are very dangerous.
The backbone of this Blitzkrieg-style operation was the fast bomber, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. Almost 35,000 of these were produced by Germany during World War II, fully half of its air fleet, and they were heavily involved in the Cretan air invasion. Also involved was the twin-engined Heinkel HE-111, one of the Germans' most important bombers. It was distinguished by its greenhouse nose, complete with rotating machine gun turret to allow greater and more precise visibility above targets. And the Dornier DO-17, known as the Flying Pencil on account of its unique, sleek design. The actual airborne invasion was slated to take place on May 20, 1941. It was a unique, high-tech enterprise of its time, the brainchild of World War I German fighter ace General Kurt Student, the head of the Air Corps and architect of a successful and highly innovative air campaign in Holland a year earlier, which carried the Sky Hunters into battle aboard gliders.
But he, like all enthusiasts, is a true believer, so he believes that this is the answer to almost everything. And this is going to be the test case, and the paratroopers will take the island, and it will be just the beginning of a whole new parachute army that he will command. And, of course, by the end of the campaign, there's not much left.
Hitler, like the army, was opposed to the plan, believing it was too costly, but was persuaded by Goering, head of the Luftwaffe. He, like Student, was a World War I fighter ace, and the Fallschirmjäger were his elite force.
Hitler says very famously that the army belongs to the Prussians, and it's a very old army. The Navy belongs to the Second Empire because it was created in the 1890s. He said, but the Luftwaffe, that's mine. You know, that was created while the Nazis were in charge. So Goering is a fully signed up long-term member of the Nazi Party. The Luftwaffe is the strike arm of the Nazi Party. That's why its defeat in the air battle over Britain is so significant. This is the first time that the Nazi arm has been defeated in battle. And there is a sense that they see winning in Crete as a kind of payback. So they're prepared to push the envelope here and to sell this as a great Nazi air and elite formations victory plays into the culture of the state.
Codenamed Operation Mercury, it involved over 500 Ju-52 transport planes. These were solid trimotors of corrugated metal, and they would drop the 14,000 paratroopers, the elite airborne force of the 7th Flieger Division, from the skies above Crete. They would be supported by another 570 aircraft. The Stukas, Junker 88s, Dorniers, Heinkels, and Messerschmitts 109s and 110s. The invasion was a showcase of supreme and innovative German air power, perhaps the greatest single example of the entire war. In the days preceding the invasion, these aircraft had been used to soften up defences on the island.
Well, it's Blitzkrieg. The Germans don't call it Blitzkrieg. They see it as an extension of their operational method that goes back into the 19th century. But an American journalist comes up with the phrase Blitzkrieg, lightning war, in 1939 following the invasion of Poland. And Hitler likes the term, and it becomes a term that the Germans use. It's a German operational method seeking decision, and they do it very rapidly. And now it has the addition of new technology, such as air power and tanks.
And commanders, if they weren't First World War veterans, they'd learnt their trade from those who had fought in the First World War. So they were speaking an entirely different language. They had no idea what to expect from an airborne invasion. When they were told that that would be followed up by reinforcements from the sea, they could imagine that. Many of them were Gallipoli veterans, so they had visualised, they had participated in a seaborne invasion. But an airborne invasion, that was totally new.
Leading up to the battle and throughout it, General Freyberg had access to German plans through Britain's secret code breakers at Bletchley Park.
He's having, I think, a cup of tea on the veranda of his outpost with a junior officer, and the news comes that the Germans have landed, and he looks at his watch and says something to the effect of just on time, because of course he knows exactly when they're supposed to be coming, and he's very impressed by the German precision.
But the British have really good intel on this. The ultra material is giving up a lot of information. The Luftwaffe, for all of its ability to drop bombs accurately, is remarkably cavalier about intelligence security.
They knew exactly where the parachutists would be dropped. Under normal circumstances, this would have meant that the Battle of Crete ended at the first day.
In the first wave of the air invasion, 8,000 paratroopers were landed. In another first in aerial warfare, the lead troops were carried aboard DFS 230 gliders. Towed by Junker Ju-52s, the gliders were released a good distance before target, silently descending upon Crete so the sound of towing aircraft would not alert the Allied forces. An objective was to knock out anti-aircraft batteries. In all, 70 gliders, each carrying 10 paratroopers, would land in the first few hours of the battle, many along the dry creek bed west of the strategic Maleme airfield, in the west of the island. The paratroopers came very well equipped, but on them, they carried just a pistol, knife, and hand grenades for weapons. But they were also kitted out with knee pads, and some carried cameras.
It is still functional, you can see. 50% of the German soldiers that were here in the Battle of Crete carried a camera with them because, of course, they wanted to remember the stages of the battle and some of them for propaganda reasons. There were about 50 propaganda company photographers. Of course, the pictures are very different from these individuals.
German parachutists then were armed by a pistol, a knife, and 3 or 4 hand grenades. The real weapons were dropped in a box, and they had to find it.
These well-equipped paratroopers, or sky hunters, became known to the Allies as the Green Devils.
Germans had also chocolate with them. They used to have this chocolate. It's chocolate with caffeine. This firm still exists. It still makes chocolate.
The German mission was first to take 3 airfields on the northern coast, at Malmö, Rethymnon and Heraklion, paving the way for the giant transports to land more troops and supplies in order to take the island.
German intelligence was abominable. It was incredibly arrogant of them to believe that really they didn't have to worry about intelligence because they always won their battles, which had been the case up until then.
The Germans knew nothing about Crete. They believed that they would be welcomed there by the population.
The key airfield was Malmö. This would be defended in a series of bloody and costly encounters, often involving hand-to-hand combat with Allied troops, mainly New Zealanders, and surprisingly for the invaders, with the local Cretan population, who'd formed themselves into militias.
We thought it was going to be a sea landing, and then all of a sudden we hear this humming coming out at the sea towards Crete, and we see it coming in, the big German junker transports. They carry about 150 troops at a time, and they were coming in just at wave height. When they come to the land of Crete, they made sufficient height for dropping off paratroopers. And then when they come over our positions where we were, the paratroopers started spewing out of their planes right on top of our different positions. Well, we looked up in awe and wonderment because we'd been trying to engage people at land level, but never coming down from the sky.
A parachutist is vulnerable, first of all, in the air, and secondly, when he lands for a minute or so, he's obviously disoriented. And the New Zealanders particularly took advantage of that.
There's 100, 150 odd paratroopers coming down on top of us, but not many of those hit the land where we were without being hit in some way or other. I didn't have to tell our fellas to let go.
We were delighted to leave the aircraft because we thought they couldn't hit us as easily as they could in the aircraft, but that was not so. In the air, I heard this whistling of bullets around me, but the whistling is not so bad to hear because you know everything you hear is already past. It can't hit you anymore. And then I looked down and I saw some soldiers.
The German aircraft had to come low and slow in front of prepared positions. The Australians and New Zealanders were expert infantry units, and given those kind of targets, they didn't miss.
They were coming in at the same level as the anti-aircraft gunners on the ground. They were firing at them without elevating their guns. Of course, made the operation much easier for the gunners. And it was close as well. I mean, the German planes were coming in, the Commonwealth and British gunners were right there. And it gives a sense of the intimacy of the battle and also the power of the air defence put up against the German paratroopers and the force that the German paratroopers had to overcome.
They could see their bullets striking German transport aircraft. They could see the paratroopers going limp as they were hit by the defenders' fire.
There were the New Zealanders and the others who went out literally in sort of man-hunting parties, just shooting them down. And also they did have a few tanks on the island. They had some light Whippet tanks, the 3rd Hussars. They went round and they were quite ruthless in the way that they would sometimes just run them down with their tracks and crush them underneath.
They land where they land, and they land right on top of the Allied positions. So in some cases, you'll have British, New Zealand, Australian officers in command posts doing their business of commanding the unit and taking out their service revolvers and shooting German paratroopers landing literally on top of them.
And I took a Bren gunner out and gave them covering fire until they got back into the battalion lines. And they charged in with the bayonets. A chap by the name of Ted Swanson was the sergeant in charge of that platoon, and Ted was out the front. He got a DCM out of it. Castleman got shot through the arm and he come in with one arm hanging down, and we got his arm fixed up. We held it in our area, and there wasn't many of those paratroopers ever landed on without had lead in them. But it seemed like a slaughter to me.
In all drop zones, the paratroopers were dropped in between and around Allied troops, making for a confused battleground with no front lines. At Maleme, the paratroopers were dropped on top of and among battalions of New Zealand troops. At Rethmanon, they were dropped either side and on top of Australian and Greek defenders protecting the airport and the city. It was a similar story in Heraklion, where the paratroopers were set down amongst Australian, Greek and British troops, also defending both the city and airfield.
There are Maori troops, New Zealand Maori troops, going in, taking the paratroopers out as they land with the bayonet. It's very brutal fighting, shooting of prisoners.
One German unit dropped on the 23rd Battalion, New Zealand Battalion. And I think within a matter of hours, 800 out of 1,000 men, Germans, parachutists, were dead.
Also, large numbers of Greek civilians are involved in the battle as well, and they join in and they suffer for it afterwards when the Germans conquer Crete. So it's interesting to see these mixed formations of mixed British and Commonwealth troops, Greek troops and also Greek civilians, some of whom are armed with knives, all attacking these paratroopers who are landing piecemeal and having to fight their battle one by one.
There were even Cretan civilians who were cutting up and killing, stabbing and or shooting with shotguns any of the paratroopers caught in the olive trees and unable to struggle out of their harnesses.
Cretans are a fierce and independent lot. And they weren't very pleased to be invaded, tying kitchen knives on the end of broomsticks. And they would be pretty savage when it came to it, yeah.
It's grim, and afterwards it's hot as well. This is May, and the bodies, many of them are hanging from olive trees in their harnesses. The local Greeks often strip off the boots of the paratroopers, and also the pockets are ripped open for any orders that they might have. The British are looking for the intelligence, but the bodies stay there hanging, and they rot very, very quickly.
German paratroopers jumping out of Junkers transports that are already on flame and their parachutes being incinerated. Another Australian veteran recalls seeing one of the paratroopers get caught in the tail of a Junkers transport and fly off into the distance, trailing behind the aeroplane on its way back to Greece. So it was a complex, difficult feat of arms that the Germans were attempting, and when things went wrong, they really did go wrong.
This is a paratrooper's gravity knife. It's a gravity knife because it goes like that. This is a common knife that all the flight crews had with them. When you see such a knife here in Crete, it's a German dead, of course. Cretans love to take these knives from the Germans as a souvenir, of course, along with their Lugers.
The Cretans even took the parachutes, which were made of silk, and made them later into clothes and dresses, even wedding dresses.
German paratroopers who survive, many of them have these, it's like an amphetamine pill to keep them fighting. They're incredibly tired, many of them are dehydrated, they've run out of food, they've run out of water, so their victory is a tribute, and we were talking earlier about the Fallschirmjäger as an elite formation, to their elite status and their willingness to endure the battle when they're there completely on their own, often out of ammunition and often out of basic supplies.
When I had to take aim at another man and shoot him, that was initially very hard. I could see the person I was going to kill, but he hadn't seen me. I hesitated. But I knew I had to shoot because I could see my comrades flying in behind me and that they would be killed if I didn't kill this man. I thought, now I have to shoot. I must. I think about it a lot. It's not the sort of thing you forget.
The key moments of the battle would happen here at the Maleme airfield. at a bridge over the Tavronatus River. The bridge is still here today. Mike Sweet is a writer and historian living in Crete who's researched the key locations of the battle, including what happened here at the bridge.
The battle for Malame, in fact the battle for Crete, started here in the Tavronatus riverbed. Around 8:30 on the morning of the 20th of May, around 40 to 50 gliders landed, crash landed in many cases, north of the bridge and south of the bridge. On the far bank, the airfield is in the distance, were New Zealand infantry protecting the bridge and trying to stem the German advance. There were about 10 men in each glider, and as the gliders landed, crash landed, many of them were injured even before they started fighting. The plan was to use the dead ground of the riverbed as the line of attack. On the eastern side, there you can see the airfield in the distance, was the New Zealand 22nd Battalion, an infantry battalion that was lined up in front of the airstrip along the banks of the river. These were the men who would try and save Maleme.
The bridge today still bears the scars of what happened here.
We're on the western side of the Tavronatus River here, and as you can see, this pylon is peppered in bullet holes. And what we know is because it's west-facing, these are bullet holes that were made by the advancing German paratroopers before they took the bridge. Now, we're on the other side of the pylon, and you can see we're facing east, and there's a few bullet holes here, probably rifle fire. And that, of course, was coming from the far bank where the New Zealand troops were dug in, using their rifles to try and stem the German attack. But look here. Look at the size of the holes on this pylon, closer to the airfield. What this shows is heavy German machine gun fire pouring down on the defenders on the far bank.
The Allied forces were blamed for their slow response to the attack on the Maleme airfield. At the end of the crucial first day, the German paratroopers had secured a foothold on the airport perimeter, and the battle was balanced on a knife edge.
It's almost a miracle that they did not lose the battle on the first day. Had Freiberg sent a company on the hill west of Tavronatus, they would have not survived as well.
The few paratroopers who survived the initial landings take up good positions, and by the end of the day, the Dominion troops have abandoned the airfield that's going to give the Germans their access point. This is just catastrophic.
The airfield at Malame was defended by a very small contingent on its western flank, and it was there that the Germans punctured the defence and got hold of that airfield, and that was what turned the battle. And Freiberg's disposition of his forces really contributed to the German success.
Despite the German advances, New Zealand brigades still occupied the olive groves on what was known as Hill 107, which had an elevated position overlooking the airstrip. But what happened next was critical.
On the 20th of May, the Germans are massacred. The bridgehead on the airfield is held by a German doctor, and as he said, had the New Zealanders counterattacked that night, we would have had to fight them off with our knives and stones because we were so short of ammunition.
This is point 107, the highest point of Hill 107, which was the vital strategic higher ground above the airfield that basically decided the battle for Malame. The 22nd New Zealand Battalion basically had defensive positions all around the hill, over across the airfield and towards Tavronatus Bridge along the perimeter of the river.
The New Zealand officer commanding the Hill 107 position, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, who'd won a Victoria Cross in World War I, said the bombing incurred by his troops on May 20 made what he'd witnessed in the Battle of the Somme appear like a picnic.
It's important to remember a couple of things about Andrew. He was injured in that devastating air attack that had happened first thing in the morning. Communications were in disarray after that attack. He could not contact his companies by the airstrip near the Tavernaitis River. And then, in a sense, that's the story of Maleme and the story of the Battle of Crete, is that companies' units were fighting in isolation. So Andrew didn't know what was going on in different parts of the battlefield.
And throughout the day, they'd been under intense mortar, ground and air attack. The Luftwaffe attack has led to a nervous collapse on his part. Even though his companies on the hill are not under direct attack, he decides that he's going to withdraw. Something happens on the 20th that breaks him. Doesn't break his battalion. His battalion has been trained and prepared to do what they did, and they do it. But at the heart of the battalion, the man who makes the decisions is broken. An idea of Andrew's state of mind can be gained from the words that he spoke to Royal. He said, "You were lucky to get off the hill alive." And in fact, there is no activity on the hill.
So Andrew decided to pull the New Zealanders off this hill. And once he'd done that, the Germans could then take the advantage.
Early morning, day 2, Maleme airfield. The German commander, General Student, takes a huge risk, which turns the battle.
He decided to send some daredevil on his staff into the Maleme airfield at dawn to see if a Junkers 52 could actually land there, or it was still under artillery fire. It was a calculated risk, but it came off.
The Battle of Crete was decided here, on this airstrip. The whole airstrip on the second day was still under fire, was still being protected by the New Zealand troops, but because they'd moved off Hill 107, there was a window of opportunity for the Germans to get in, and they did. And what they did was they landed their transports, crash-landed them in some cases, even after being hit. They would land them on the beach, on the coast here, and suddenly the balance of power had shifted. Suddenly there was an air bridge into Crete, which allowed the Germans to dominate the situation here and to put increasing pressure onto the defenders. Once they had started to fly in scores of aircraft, which littered this airstrip full of ammunition, reinforcements, troops, supplies, guns, motorbikes, they had it now. They had a foothold in Crete, and that was key, because it would affect every single battle from then on.
Within a day or two, he got something like 10,000 mountain troops, which made up for the very heavy casualties that the German parachutists had on the first day.
Freiburg was heavily criticised for continuing to plan for a seaborne attack and for spreading his forces too thinly across Crete's northern coast. British historians said it would prove the most costly and strategic miscalculation of the brief campaign.
He, as a First World War officer, could not believe that an island could be captured from the air. And so when he heard in the ultra decrypts, the signals intelligence decrypts, that there was going to be a reinforcement coming by sea, he immediately turned everything back to front, and he believed, therefore, that it was going to be a seaborne invasion, basically backed by an airborne attack. And so everything was back to front, and this was actually the reason why the island fell.
So the standard intelligence dilemma is, do you use the information you have now and risk discovery, Or do you use it more sparingly in order to preserve the longevity of what you have? And Freiberg is caught in that problem. So he's given very full information on what the Germans plan to do, but also told not to betray the fact that we have it. So his inclination might be to rush reinforcements to certain points, but if he does that give the game away? It's a very difficult balance for him.
But when it came to, I'm afraid, intelligence in both senses of the term, he did not have a clear mind. And the trouble was that because the ultra material was so secret, he couldn't discuss it with anybody else. He'd been ordered not to.
So you could say, probably, perhaps unfairly, that he was the first commander in history who knew exactly what the enemy was doing and still managed to lose the battle.
But New Zealand historians say Freiberg's planning was correct, but he was let down by his brigade commanders at Maleme.
I believe that people who criticise Freiberg on Crete have studied the maps but haven't walked the ground. He had to fight a series of independent battles, but he knew right from the outset, because of Ultra, that the German target were the airfields.
Pugsley says Andrew's commander, Brigadier James Hargest, was too slow to respond once Andrew had pulled off Hill 107. And then his commander, Brigadier Edward Puttock, then failed to provide reinforcements.
The failure is not Freiberg's. The failure is New Zealand commanders within the New Zealand division. At each level, a New Zealand commander hesitates, makes the wrong decision. A lack of initiative and dysfunctional commanders lose Crete. And that was New Zealand's failing, but it's certainly not Freiberg's, because Freiberg has set a plan in place, and the Brits under Chappell carry it out, the Australians under Campbell carry it out, and the New Zealanders failed to carry it. Had Andrew done nothing, the New Zealanders would have won that battle. But he decides to withdraw, and that's pulling on that piece of wool, and the entire jumper unravels, because Crete is lost from that point.
They failed to understand that the critical point for an airborne invasion is the place where you can land the transport planes and bring in the non-paratroopers. And so, yes, the long airfield that had been improved for Royal Air Force bombers to fly from ends up being the sally port through which the besieging forces come, to use a medieval analogy. That's the open door. They could have done better. They could have dug up the airfield. They could have filled it with junk so it was useless. They could have made a better effort, and by the end of the first day, they'd essentially lost the key to the whole position. The airfield is the one that's nearest to Germany. It's the one over which the Messerschmitt 109s can operate for just enough time to be useful. The other end of Crete, 109s can't even operate. So it really was the pivot point of the battle, and to lose that on the first, essentially the first day, really poor.
Despite a bold counterattack at Maleme, involving brave fighting from Freiberg's New Zealand brigades, it came too late, and the Allies were unable to take the airfield, allowing the Germans to begin building a crucial bridgehead. This enabled the landing of more paratroopers and hardened fighters from the 7th Mountain Division. With the Maleme Air Base finally secure, it took each Ju-52 just over a minute to touch down, drop their troops, and take off. As the reinforcements arrived, the invaders began spreading out.
The German army had a system of operations where the mission was devolved down to the lowest level of officer, NCO, corporal, sergeants, and then a private. So in many armies, when the officer dies, the soldiers stop because they don't know what the mission is. But in the German army, the tactics devolve down. So when the officer dies, the sergeant takes over. If the sergeant is killed, the corporal takes over. So it keeps the momentum going. And even the lowliest private knows what the mission is. And what he knows is he has to achieve the mission. How he achieves it is up to him. So it gives the German army a very aggressive, kinetic momentum. two planes, single-engine planes, that are used most directly in close air support are the Messerschmitt 109 and the Stuka, the Ju-87, the Junker 87. The Junker 87 is very famous because when it comes down, it makes this shrill noise, which is a sort of terrifying scream, and then it releases its bomb at the bottom part of its dive, and it obviously pulls up.
The Stuka is nothing but a precise artillery to the spot. When the mountaineers moved forward, they were assisting them.
Many of the troops on Crete remember the scream of the Me-109 coming over on strafing runs.
They were able to drop bombs to the meter.
Next time, with victory for the Germans at Maleme now secure, the Allies would begin a series of dramatic rearguard and counter-attack actions. 20,000 of their troops were still on Crete. How to protect them and get them off the island.